Welcome back to World Wrestlers History, the home of wrestling's greatest legends, untold truths, and the stories that shaped the ring forever. Today, we bring you one of wrestling's darkest, most shocking tragedies, the story of the death of Bruiser Brody. A man loved by fans, feared by his rivals, and respected across the globe, yet taken from the world far too soon. This is not just a story about wrestling. It's a story about power, betrayal, and injustice that still haunts the wrestling world to this day. Bruiser Brody, born Frank Donald Goodish on June 18, 1946, in Warren, Pennsylvania, was more than a wrestler, he was a force of nature. Standing at 6 feet 8 inches and weighing nearly 300 pounds, he was built like a monster but had the soul of a rebel. Before stepping into the ring, Brody was a gifted athlete, playing football at Warren High School and later at West Texas State University. He even had a short run with the NFL's Washington Redskins before destiny called him somewhere far more chaotic, the world of professional wrestling. From the first time he laced up his boots, Brody was different. He didn't follow scripts or play nice with promoters. He fought with fury, wildness, and honesty. When he came out swinging a chain in his hand, fans knew chaos was coming. He brawled through crowds, threw chairs, and broke rules, but that was the point. Bruiser Brody wasn't a gimmick. He was real. Every punch, every roar, every glare, it was raw power. He was a warrior in boots, a man who lived for the thrill of the fight and the respect of the audience. As the years passed, Brody became one of the biggest attractions in wrestling, especially in Japan. The Japanese fans adored him. They saw him not as a villain, but as a wild hero, a symbol of strength, courage, and rebellion. Alongside stars like Stan Hansen, Brody tore through All Japan Pro Wrestling, leaving behind bloody matches and unforgettable memories. To fans and fellow wrestlers, he was both terrifying and magnetic, a man who could make a stadium roar just by stepping through the curtain. But behind the legend was a man of principle. Brody was known to stand up for himself and for others. He demanded fair pay, refused to be cheated, and never let anyone control his narrative. In an era when wrestlers were often exploited by promoters, Bruiser Brody was one of the few who stood his ground. He was not just strong in body, he was strong in spirit. Yet that very spirit, that fearless independence, would eventually lead him into the most tragic night of his life. The year was 1988. Brody was still performing around the world, splitting his time between Japan and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's wrestling scene was booming, dominated by the World Wrestling Council, the WWC, run by Carlos Colon, a local hero and respected promoter. Brody had worked there before, often drawing massive crowds. But behind the scenes, tensions had been brewing. Brody was reportedly owed money from previous shows, and there were disagreements with some of the local wrestlers, including Jose Huertas Gonzalez, better known in the ring as Invader One. Gonzalez wasn't just another wrestler. He was also part of the WWC's inner circle. And according to several people, he and Brody didn't see eye to eye. Brody's reputation for being outspoken and unwilling to be pushed around clashed with the power structure that existed in Puerto Rico. To Brody, wrestling was business, fair pay for fair work. To others, his attitude came off as arrogance. What nobody could imagine was how that tension would explode into one of wrestling's most horrifying moments. It was the evening of July 16, 1988. The humid air hung heavy over Bayamon, Puerto Rico. Wrestlers gathered in the locker room of the Juan Ramon Lubriel Stadium, preparing for another night of action. The crowd outside was loud and eager, ready for a night of chaos and excitement. Inside, though, the atmosphere was oddly tense. Tony Atlas, Dutch Mantel, and several other wrestlers were present. Bruiser Brody arrived, calm and casual, carrying his bag and towel. He greeted a few of the boys, sat down, and began preparing for his match. According to Tony Atlas, Brody seemed in good spirits that night. He even showed Atlas a photo of his son and smiled, saying he couldn't wait to see him again after the tour. Moments later, Jose Gonzalez entered the locker room. He approached Brody and told him he wanted to speak with him privately. The two men walked toward the shower area, out of sight from the others. Within minutes, a loud scream pierced through the locker room. The sound was sharp, desperate, and chilling. Atlas and the others turned toward the noise. When they reached the shower area, they froze. Brody was clutching his stomach, blood pouring from a deep wound. His massive body staggered forward as he gasped for air. Atlas rushed to catch him, shouting for help. The scene was chaos, people screaming, others running, some frozen in shock. Atlas saw the knife in Gonzalez's hand. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A man had just stabbed one of wrestling's biggest stars right in front of them, in the locker room. As Brody collapsed, Atlas cradled him, pressing a towel against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. He kept talking to him, telling him to stay awake, to hold on. The other wrestlers called for an ambulance, but in Puerto Rico that night, response time was painfully slow. It took more than 45 minutes for an ambulance to arrive. Brody was in unbearable pain, yet he never lost consciousness during the initial chaos. He kept whispering through the pain, trying to breathe. When the ambulance finally arrived, Tony Atlas helped lift Brody onto the stretcher himself. The paramedics struggled with his size and weight, and Atlas had to physically carry part of Brody's body into the vehicle. Even then, he refused to leave his friend's side. But officials told him to stay back. Brody was rushed to the hospital, while the rest of the locker room was left in stunned silence. A few continued the show that night, unbelievably, while others sat in shock, unsure what had just happened. At the hospital, surgeons worked frantically to save Bruiser Brody's life. The knife wounds had been deep, one of them piercing his liver. He lost a tremendous amount of blood. Despite several hours of surgery, Brody's heart couldn't hold on. In the early hours of July 17, 1988, the wrestling world lost one of its fiercest warriors. Bruiser Brody was dead at just 42 years old. The news spread like wildfire. Fans in Puerto Rico, Japan, and the United States were stunned. How could this happen? How could one of wrestling's toughest men be murdered, not in a dark alley or a bar fight, but in a locker room surrounded by his peers? Wrestlers everywhere mourned, but soon grief turned to anger as the details of what followed came to light. The police investigation was chaotic from the start. Many wrestlers later said the authorities didn't take the case seriously at first. Evidence was reportedly mishandled, and several eyewitnesses were never properly questioned. Jose Gonzalez was charged with murder, but the trial that followed was one of the most controversial in wrestling history. The official claim made by Gonzalez was that he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Brody had threatened him during a private conversation and that he feared for his life. But many who knew Brody found this hard to believe. While Brody could be intense and intimidating in the ring, those close to him described him as calm and reasonable outside of it. Tony Atlas, who witnessed the aftermath, insisted that Brody never attacked Gonzalez, and that he was taken completely by surprise. The real tragedy, however, was not just the crime, it was the justice system's failure to deliver truth. Several key witnesses, including Atlas, never testified in court. Why? Because they received their court summons long after the trial had already taken place. The trial date had been moved, and the letters arrived too late. Without their testimony, the case was one-sided. In 1989, Jose Gonzalez was acquitted of all charges on the grounds of self-defense. The wrestling community was outraged. To many, it felt like an open wound, a murder in plain sight, brushed under the rug. Tony Atlas, Dutch Mantel, and others who were there never forgot what they saw. For them, the memory of that night in Puerto Rico was burned into their souls forever. Atlas later said that he could still see Brody's face, pale, gasping, and fighting for life, every time he closed his eyes. In the years that followed, the World Wrestling Council continued to operate. Carlos Colon, who had been one of Brody's colleagues and promoters, carried on with his career. Many wrestlers avoided Puerto Rico after that. The locker room would never be the same again. The fear, distrust, and anger that followed Brody's death divided the wrestling community. Some called it the biggest betrayal in wrestling history, the night the business lost its honor. Bruiser Brody's legacy, however, did not die with him. In Japan, fans mourned him like a fallen warrior. Every year, All Japan Pro Wrestling honored his memory with tributes. Wrestlers like Stan Hansen, who had been his close friend and tag partner, carried chains to the ring in his memory. Even decades later, fans in Japan still chant his name, waving their arms and swinging imaginary chains to the sound of Brody. Brody! Brody! For them, he remains eternal, the spirit of chaos and freedom in professional wrestling. In America, younger wrestlers grew up studying his matches, learning from his intensity and authenticity. Men like Mick Foley, Luke Harper, Brody Lee, and Jon Moxley have all cited Bruiser Brody as an inspiration. His influence can be seen in every wild brawl, every fearless promo, every unfiltered display of passion in the ring. He was a blueprint for those who refused to play safe. He was proof that wrestling could be more than performance, it could be art, emotion, and rebellion all rolled into one. But for those who knew him personally, there is always the pain of what could have been. Friends like Stan Hansen and Tony Atlas never stopped speaking about him, making sure the world would remember the man behind the legend. Brody wasn't just a brute, he was intelligent, loyal, and deeply caring toward his family and friends. He had a young son he adored in dreams beyond the ring. Many believe that if he had lived, he would have transitioned into promoting or training, using his voice to fight for wrestlers' rights and fairness in the business he loved. Even now, more than 3 decades later, the story of Bruiser Brody's death is whispered with sadness and disbelief. Fans debate what really happened in that locker room, and why true justice was never served. Some say it was politics, others blame corruption or fear. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain, the wrestling world lost one of its bravest souls that night. His story serves as both a warning and a legacy. A warning of what happens when loyalty is broken and power is abused, and a legacy that shows what it means to live without compromise. Bruiser Brody didn't play by anyone's rules but his own. He walked into the ring like a storm and left behind thunder that still echoes across generations. Every time a wrestler swings a chair, charges into a crowd, or breaks the mold of what wrestling should be, a piece of Bruiser Brody lives on. Every chant, every tribute, every story told in his name keeps that fire alive. He may have been silenced that night in Puerto Rico, but his spirit remains untouchable. No knife, no injustice, no cover-up can erase the legend of Bruiser Brody. And so, the story of his death remains one of wrestling's greatest tragedies, not just because of how he died, but because of what it revealed about the world he lived in. A world of glory and pain, of fame and betrayal, of loyalty and deception. A world where even giants can fall. But through it all, Bruiser Brody stands immortal, a warrior whose roar still echoes through every wrestling arena around the world. Thanks for watching World Wrestlers History, where we honor the lives, legacies, and untold stories of wrestling's greatest warriors. If you believe Bruiser Brody deserved justice, and that his spirit still lives on through every fight, every roar, and every fan who remembers his name, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Until next time, keep the legend alive, because true warriors never die.